Sandra from across the road. For background, I live in rural Ireland, and the story begins when I was a child in the mid to late 90s and came to head in 2015 when I was 21 years old. As I mentioned, I live in rural Ireland, in the Midlands to be exact. I'm the youngest of 6 kids and grew up in a pretty classic traditional Irish Catholic family. As a child, I'd always been made aware of our next door neighbors who lived directly across the road. Their house and our house are located across from each other, and we are each other's only direct neighbors. Here lived an older couple with their sole daughter, Sandra. The couple were strange and never seemed to leave the house much. They rarely interacted with my family or my parents, rendering our relationship with them pretty much non existent. Sandra was in her late teens to early 20s when I was a child, and I was always scared of her. She had long black hair, usually greasy hair, and pasty skin. She rarely left the house, and had an aura which felt unhinged and unpredictable. Those feelings were enhanced by the actions and stories I was told about her by my family. Keep in mind, this story begins in the 80s, and Ireland when kids were allowed to roam free a lot more than now. My eldest sister, Mary, was one who experienced the most negative encounter with her. When she was young, Sandra took a particular interest in her and always tried to chalk up a friendship with her. Sandra would have been 4 to 5 years older. My sister Mary would entertain these interests to an extent, mainly out of politeness, but it was always met with another reason to be freaked out by Sandra. It started when Mary used to wait for the bus at the end of our gate in the mornings. Sandra rarely attended school, as it seemed her parents had no control over her. When she would spot my sister waiting for the bus, she would open her window ajar and turn on heavy screamo metal music to try and scare my sister. Mary recalls that she'd turn on the music, she'd part her bedroom curtain slightly, and would catch Sandra smiling and seemingly taking delight in making my sister uncomfortable. You may think, what's the harm in some metal music in the morning? But keep in mind, this was taking place at 7 o'clock in the morning on misty, dark, cold, desolate Irish mornings, as a young girl waited herself for the bus. My sister recalls that once her bus finally turned up, Sandra would lower the music and close the curtains. This continued for weeks, until my mother noticed my sister became to be so reluctant and scared to get to the bus by herself before she finally got out of what was going on. Sister and mother stood at the bus stop every morning from then on with my mother's arms crossed, staring out Sandra's window, which stopped the music playing pretty quickly. The freakish nature of Sandra started to ramp up as more time went on. The summer of the same year, Mary ended up spending an extra odd day here and there with Sandra due to the lack of the variety of people to hang out with in rural Ireland and the lengthy nature of the school summer holidays. One day, Sandra convinced my sister to come into her house. My sister recalls the house being pretty normal up until entering Sandra's bedroom. The room was dimly lit and had a pang of mustiness that my sister knew our mother would kill us over if our rooms were kept in the same condition. The walls were covered in graphic posters of devilish-themed metal bands and gory computer games of the time, such as Mortal Kombat. Mary felt uneasy the whole time, but also curious to see behind these walls. That my family spent hours conjuring up stories of the over-exaggerated possibilities that laid behind them. After a while, Sandra offered to play a Ouija board with my sister. Mary had no clue what this was and said, yeah, why not? She knows the whole time Sandra kept her gaze on her as much as she could, and seemed to get pleasure in knowing my sister was uncomfortable. My sister was disappointed with the lack of fun or action in this so-called game and left to head home. Sandra convinced my sister to call over a couple more times that summer, and continually pressed to play this Ouija board game. My mom started to become more concerned as Mary bizarrely started to ask questions about humans and animal sacrifice. She pressed my sister on why and where she had heard of these things, and my sister revealed that Sandra had books on these topics, as well as the occult, and she'd been showing them and lending them to my sister. As you can imagine, this most certainly did not go well with my mother at the time. She marched across the road still with her apron from cooking the dinner and firmly knocked on the neighbor's door. After a stern conversation and a notification that Sandra was not to come near her children again, Sandra seemed to take glee in the trouble that had caused, and happily told my mother that she'd also perform multiple Ouija board sessions with my sister, and that she'd hoped the demon would now possess my sister. This sealed the deal, and our neighbors were officially blacklisted within my house. A couple years later, I came along, and stories such as these and many others not only circulated in my childhood to reinforce the ban on ever going near their house. Sandra seemed nightmarish to me, and I feared the sight of her, to be honest. She became more deranged as the years went on, and supposedly even caused a split in the marriage of her parents. If the story ended here, I guess it would be a pretty tame story about a kind of freaky neighbor and no more, but that is not the case. Sandra burst back into our lives one night in an almost comical way that mirrored that of a horror movie. I was 21 years old by the stage, and Sandra was nothing more than a scary figure from my childhood that seemed more a part of a local lore than actual reality, like an urban legend even. It was a particularly gloomy autumn night in 2015. There was a blustery wind and heavy rainfall. It seemed fitting in the lead up to Halloween. By this stage, it was just me, my brother who has special needs, and my niece living at home with my parents. This particular night, my dad was on a business trip to England, so it was just the rest of us at home. Over the years, there had been 2 car accidents outside my house, as it's situated on a dangerous bend on the road, causing the death of 3 people. At around 2 a.m. this night, I was awoken by a scream from outside our front door. I shot up on my bed, and my mind immediately raced to the thought that there had been another accident. I heard another wail, and my heart started to race as I ran down the stairs in a flash. As I reached the hallway and turned onto the front door, I was met with a face staring through the window pane, and it was one that I'll never, ever forget. Her hair had gotten thinner and seemed patchy on her head. Her cheeks were sunken in, and her eyes looked deranged. It was like she looked completely right through me. She began repeatedly calling out for my parents' name. By this stage, the shock of the situation had slightly worn off, and I realized I had a complete stranger screaming at me through the door. I cautiously asked who she was and what was wrong, but she just kept screaming my parents' name over and over like she was possessed. I slightly opened the door as I wasn't sure if she could hear me or not, or even properly see me, as she seemed to have a glassed over look in her eyes. Once the door slightly opened, she pushed through and grabbed my arm. She started shouting my older brother's name now, who she must have thought it was me. I tried to calm her down, but to no avail, and managed to backtrack upstairs to go and get my mother. When I got to her room, she was already up, and as I began to explain the situation of what was happening, she stopped me and just said, "Sandra." I followed my mom downstairs and watched in horror as Sandra dropped to the floor at the sight of my mother. She now began wailing about her dog and how it was in trouble. By this stage, the smell of her began to become obvious and was obnoxiously filling the room. It smelled like the mix of weed and alcohol. Sandra began to become more coherent in her speech and tried to explain that her dog was being trapped in her car by her boyfriend. She kept screaming over and over that her dog was going to die, and if she went back with her boyfriend, she would beat the shit out of her too. Seeing all this unfold was so unsettling, as well as seeing my now older mother trying to handle this. By this stage, we began to hear calling from outside the door. I walked over and peered out, and could actually see the silhouette of an elderly male figure slowly dragging himself up our driveway. He was calling out Sandra's name, and as he got closer, we realized it was her elderly father, who we had not seen in years. He seemed agitated, but also embarrassed by Sandra's actions. We never found out if Sandra's boyfriend was doing what she claimed he was doing, as her father started to drag her away, while apologizing for disturbing us. As he dragged her reluctantly down the driveway, she repeatedly called out my parents' names, while screaming for help. The night sort of just wound up from there, and we never found out what happened. We haven't heard or seen from Sandra since that night, but we did sadly hear that her father passed away recently. There have been many more stories of things that Sandra did to my family over the years that I did not mention, some of which include lying and creating stories trying to get us in trouble with the guards, Irish police. I can discuss more in the comments if people are interested. Either way, I hope me and my family never encounter more trouble from this woman again. The Hitchhiker's Backpack. This happened to me when I lived in Missouri about 10 years ago. My live-in boyfriend, Red, had a best friend who lived much further north from us, about a 3-hour drive along the interstate, so they didn't get to see each other too often. Occasionally, Jim, Red's best friend, would come down south for a long weekend and stay at the apartment with us. He was an attractive, successful guy who loved to dote on his friends and have fun, and as such, was always looking for adventure. On this particular weekend, Jim showed up at our door with 2 people and a dog in tow. Apparently, as he was driving down the interstates, he noticed the group hitchhiking, and because Jim loved adventure and was genuinely a nice guy, he picked them up. They were looking to go much farther south than where we lived, and since it was late when they got there, we eventually agreed to let them sleep in our living room overnight. Now, let me just say that I know that's a sketchy decision, but because we were young, I was 18 at the time, trusted Jim, who would be sleeping in the living room with them, and generally kind people, we allowed it. This isn't something I would ever consider at this point in my life. In any case, the hitchhikers' names were Tammy and Keith. We were under the impression that they were boyfriend and girlfriend, and they both seemed really quite nice. We all sat around drinking that night, and had a pretty good time playing games and hanging out. We made a bit of a party of it, and ended up inviting over another friend, Jack, an intense big guy of some kind of descent. I think Simone, who would get very protective of his friends, but it was just a big friendly teddy bear in general, you know? At one point, Tammy brought her dog out to do its business. Jack went with her to smoke a cigarette because we didn't allow it in the apartment. It was a hot summer evening, and back then, we were too poor to run the AC all the time, so we had the windows open. About 15 minutes after Tammy went to take the dog out, we heard the screeching of tires and the most pathetic, sad yelping I've ever heard in my life. I can still hear them in my mind to this day. We ran outside to see what was happening, to find Tammy bawling while Jack carried her dog in his arms towards our door. Apparently, the dog ran out in front of a car. He was unleashed and was hit in the hindquarters. He wasn't able to walk and was whimpering, his hind legs looking very wrong. Jack was a kind person, but wasn't always known for his tact, and after he set the dog down on our front lawn, he looked at me and Red and told us, loudly enough that Tammy would have been able to hear, that he thought the dog was a goner, because he could see blood coming from his nose, as if his lungs were punctured. This is also the night that we met our upstairs neighbors. She heard the commotion and came downstairs to see what was happening. As it turned out, she was just a technician for the local animal hospital. Because Tammy was a drifter, she was kind enough to take the dog in that night and do what she could. The whole time, Jack was shaking his head, saying it wasn't worth the effort. However, the kindness that my neighbor showed that night was amazing. She and Tammy left together with the dog, and were gone for a few hours before Tammy showed up back at our door, her face stained with tears. Her dog passed not long after they brought him to the animal hospital. The night was understandably somber after that point. The next day, Red and I felt badly about Tammy's misfortune with her dog, and told her and Keith that they could stay another couple nights to get everything together before they started on their way again. By the time Monday came, Jim was getting ready to head back home, and Red and I had to go back to work, so we made an agreement with Tammy and Keith that they could stay another night, as long as they found other things to do during the daytime. As much as they were okay to hang out with, we didn't want them just sitting around our apartment alone, you know? So we would tell them to come back around the time that we would get home that day. On Mondays, I would get out of work first before Red. By the time I got back to the apartment, Tammy was already sitting on the front steps, smoking a cigarette. She looked nervous. As I let her in, she mumbled that she needed to talk to me about something. Once inside, she started telling me about her relationship with Keith. They were not actually boyfriend and girlfriend. They were strangers to each other. She met him somewhere north of St. Louis, just the day before they met Jim, and he seemed nice enough, so they started traveling together. "Have you seen his backpack?" she asked. I had. But I hadn't really thought anything of it. Everyone's got stuff, right? Have you noticed how protective he is of it? That I hadn't noticed. But thinking back on it now, he did always seem to have it tucked beside him, or behind him, wherever he sat, and never had it too far away from him. Again, that didn't seem terribly odd for someone whose entire life was likely in that backpack. He's got kids' clothes in it. Like, little kids' clothes. I caught him pulling them out and sniffing them the other day, and every piece he took out, he would lay down flat on the grass, as if he was making a little person on the ground. This definitely got the alarms in my head going off. Tammy also said his wallet had a driver's license in it that was either not his or his real name wasn't even Keith. She said that when she had her dog with her, she felt safe, but that she didn't want to travel with him anymore and she was scared. "Have you noticed his tattoos?" she asked. I had noticed that he had tattoos, mostly along his neck, and I could see a little ink peeking out below his sleeves on his arms. Yeah, he keeps pulling those sleeves down along his arms because on his right shoulder it says Aryan, and on the left it says Army. Well, Red was 100% Bengali, which means that most people assumed he was Arab. Once Red got home, we talked about it. He was also creeped out about the kid's clothing, but quite worried about the implications of Keith's tattoos. So as young, inexperienced, non-confrontational people, we decided to just go in to lock all our doors and pretend no one was home when he showed up that night to sleep. When we did, we stayed quiet until he went away. Our apartment was on the second floor, so we were able to watch him out the corner of a window until he gave up and left. I remember having to stay near silent for almost a half hour as he hung around our doorway and glanced down the street looking for signs of us. The next couple of days we allowed Tammy to stay with us. We learned that she was 17 and had to run away from home, convinced that she hated her life at home and wanted to go on a journey to discover herself. But the longer she was away, the more she hated being away, and now she was scared to go anywhere without her dog. Eventually, we convinced her to call her mother, who she hadn't spoken to in weeks. Her mother was so relieved to hear from her, but the tears that Tammy shed when she was finally able to hear her mother's voice told us everything we needed to know. Red and I pooled our money and bought Tammy a bus ticket to go back to her hometown. That was great. The last we ever saw of her was when we dropped her off at the bus stop. I still think of her sometimes. I hope she's doing well. A few days after Tammy left, we saw Keith wandering around near the river. Thankfully, that was the last time we saw of him too, and Keith. Let's not meet again.